89, as we take a look at estimating, we're going to talk about a couple different ways that we can do estimating. The first method we're using is rounding, and I think that's probably the one that you are most familiar with. You round a certain place value, you then add or subtract your amounts. When you estimate, typically what we're not doing is do the actual and then round your answer. Okay, that's not what we're talking about for estimating. What we're talking about for estimating is do something to your values first and then add or subtract. Okay, do something to those values first and then add or subtract. All right, so as we take a look at the first one, we're using rounding to estimate. We've got a singer recording CD. We've got the length of the 3 songs. We would know about how much recording time will be on the CD. We're going to round each of these to the nearest whole number. By rounding to the nearest whole number, that means we're going to round to the nearest ones place. So you need to understand that the whole number means that we're rounding to the nearest 1. The word about tells us that we're estimating. The nearest whole number would mean that we're rounding to the ones place. Okay. Because if we have a whole piece of pie, we've got 1 pie. All right. If we have 2 whole pieces of pie, we have nothing in the decimal values. Okay. So as we take a look at 3 and 4 tenths, 3 is in the ones place, so 4 tells us to keep the 3 the same. If we look at 2 and 78 hundredths, 7 is in the tenths place. That will tell us to round the 2 up to a 3. If we look at 4 and 19 hundredths, 4 is in the ones place. The 1 tells us to keep the 4 the same. So now we are adding 3, 3, and 4 together. So when we add 3, 3, and 4 together, we get a total of 10. So it's going to be about 10 minutes of recording time on the CD. Any questions on that? Any questions on how to round numbers? Okay. So when we look at part A, it says round to the nearest whole dollar. All right. Well, again, because it's a whole dollar, that means we don't want any cents involved when we're done. Okay. So if you went to the grocery store and it cost $27.95, the question would be, is it closer to $27 or $28? And in this case, because it's 95 cents, a 9 would tell us to round that 27 up to 28. It's $11.72. Is it closer to $11 or $12? It's closer to $12 because that 7 would tell us to round up to the 2. So it's 28 minus 12, and you're of course writing all this down, but that pencil was on the table, so I don't know how you were writing it all down. So 28 minus 12 now is what you're going to be using. And when you subtract 12 from 28, what do you end up with? 16. So to the nearest dollar, it's going to be about $16. Now, another option we would have had for this one is rounding to the nearest $10. Rounding to the nearest $10. So if we're rounding to the nearest $10, then we're clear over here in the tens column. And in that case, the 7 would tell us to do what with the 2?
Round up.
To what?
Round up.
Okay, so it becomes $30. And this 1 would tell us to do what with the 1? So it'd be $10. So $30 minus $10 is going to be $20. So another estimate we could have used would have been $20. Okay, so you will have to decide how you're rounding based on what the directions say to do. Does that make sense? Okay, so you're paying attention to directions. All right. Now, in the real world, you will determine your estimating based on the situation. Okay, so let's say that you go to the grocery store and you're having to determine how much money you're going to need, spend, whatever. You might want to determine whether you're going to round to the nearest dollar or the nearest $10. Well, if I'm at the grocery store, I probably want to round to the nearest dollar because most of my items are not going to be this expensive, right? okay? So rounding to the nearest dollar is probably gonna give me a better estimate than rounding to the nearest $10, okay? If I'm somewhere that a lot of things are in the $10 range or above, you have a lot of $10 stuff or above, then maybe rounding to the nearest $10 is good enough, okay? So depending on your situation, you might determine what place value you're rounding to based on what it is you're purchasing or what the numbers are you're dealing with, okay? Because if they're big numbers, rounding to the nearest whole dollar probably is not needed, maybe $10. Maybe you're buying really expensive stuff, maybe to the nearest $100 is what you need to use, okay? So if you're building a house, let's say, rounding to the nearest whole dollar is really probably not what you want to do. You may want to go to the nearest $100, maybe the nearest $1,000, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So depending on what numbers you're dealing with might determine what place value you're rounding to, all right? Now, when you're working with the cost of items, do you want to overestimate or underestimate your total cost that you want to buy? So let's say your parents send you into the grocery store, okay? Do you want to overestimate or underestimate the cost and why? Write a sentence or two, please, and then we'll discuss. Overestimate or underestimate, and why? Who would like to share their answer? Zachary, what did you say?
I said underestimate because you might not have enough money.
Okay. By underestimating, you said underestimate?
Yeah.
That means that the estimate you came up with was less than the actual cost. Is that what you really meant?
Yeah.
And then you said because you might not have enough money. So if the items cost $10 and you estimated 9, you wouldn't have enough money. So I think you meant overestimate. Is that right? Huh? Okay, so you really meant overestimate because you might not have enough money. So if the items cost $10 and you overestimated and had said 11, you would have enough money then, right? Okay, all right.
I said overestimate because you want to have more than what you need just in case it's more than you thought.
Okay, there you go. All right. So if you overestimate, okay, then you'll have more than enough money for what you need, which is kind of what you were saying when you said it in reverse. Does that make sense? Okay.
Overestimate because you'll get change back, but if you underestimate, you'll say you don't have enough money to buy it.
Okay. All right. So you'd rather have change back than to get up there and not have enough money for your purchase, right? Okay. and then you can't buy it. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay?
Because if you buy something that is $16.39, then you have to see if the amount is closer to zero, or if the 16 is closer to 20, then it will be $20.
Okay, all right. So again, if you're talking money, you always want to be sure, if you're trying to buy something, you want to be sure that you overestimate rather than underestimate, because if you need to buy it, you got to have more than enough money there to buy it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So let that be a lesson to you. If you are going to estimate and you're talking money and you want to purchase it, look at what place value you might want to use so that you have enough money. Okay? All right. Let's clear that off and go to the next page. All right. So that's rounding. Another method is to use benchmarks. Benchmarks. Okay? Benchmarks mean that you can not go to like 0 or 1, like the next whole amount, but that you use things that are in between. All right? So if we use things that are in between, we would use things like 0, 50 cents, or $1. Does that make sense? Okay? And in using those benchmarks, very often our estimates are closer to the actual than if we were rounding like to the nearest whole dollar. Those come in handier if you are using like just the cents, all right? Because if you're not using dollars and cents, then you are not going to have, you're going to put 0 or $1 all the time. Does that make sense? All right. So if you use benchmarks, you can use things that are in between, like 0 and 1, or 1 and 2, or 2 and 3. Okay. So as we take a look at those, we're using 1800s and 4300s, 1800s and 4300s. All right. We're going to use the benchmarks here. Okay. Now, on this one, we can use 2500s, we can use 5000s, we can use 7500s. We can use then the whole number. So we've got 4 different ones, or we could use like 0, 5000s, and the 1 whole. All right. But because they have them benchmarked at all of these places listed, let's use all of those that are listed. So our first one is 1800s. Is 1800s closer to 0, 2500s, 5000s, 7500s, or 1? 2500s. So if we were talking money, we would say, is 18 cents closer to 0 or 25 cents, right? And it's closer to 25 cents. So we would use 2500s there. Is 4300s closer to 25 cents or 50 cents? And if we're thinking about that, our 4300s is going to be somewhere in there. So it's going to be closer to 50 cents. So now we have 25 cents and 50 cents, and that gives us an estimate of 75 cents or 7500s. So that's what a benchmark does for us. Otherwise, we would have had 0 plus 0 is 0. Is that real helpful on an estimate? Not at all. Okay. All right. So 1800s plus 4300s is about 7500s by using the benchmark. Okay. So as we take a look at example 2, 7600s minus 2200s. Well, if we put 7600s on there, it's somewhere real close right there. So it's close to 7500s. And 2200s is right in here. It's close to 2500s. So 7500s minus 2500s is 50 hundredths. So our estimate would be 50 hundredths. Questions on benchmark? Anybody? So we use benchmark. Let's use what they have for a benchmark here on our number line. Does that make sense? Okay. Other benchmarks could be used, but for consistency, let's use what they have on this number line for our benchmark. All right? Questions on that? Okay. Let's go over here too, because benchmark is newer. Let's try some more benchmark ones. Okay. Let's take a look at number 9. Number 9 has 12 and 41 hundredths. 12 and 41 hundredths. Well, 12 is going to stay there, right? That's not going to change. Okay. 41 hundredths, is it closer to 25 hundredths or 50 hundredths? 50 hundredths. Okay. The 6 and 47 hundredths. Well, the 6 is not going to change. Is 47 hundredths closer to 25 hundredths or 50 hundredths? 50 hundredths. And now we need to subtract. Well, that gives us 0 and that gives us 6. So our estimate would be 6 and 0 hundredths. Does that make sense? Questions on that? Let's go over here and look at number 11. 9 and 75 hundredths. Well, it's right on 75 hundredths. So are we going to change that? Are we going to change that? It's right at 75 hundredths. Do we need to change it? No. 3 and 47 hundredths. What do we want to change that to if we're using benchmark? 3 and 50 hundredths. And now we subtract. And we get 6 and 25 hundredths using our benchmark. So questions on benchmark? Anybody? Are we good with this concept? Questions on it? Yes.
Okay, so when the number has 75 on it,
We're going to use 0, 25 hundredths, 50 hundredths, 75 hundredths, and 1. Those will be our benchmarks. Okay? So whatever it's closest to. Does that help you? So if it's already there, we don't need to change it. All right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody? All right. Let's take a look then at our practice page. On 193, let's do 1 through 10, please. 1 through 10. And then 194, we'll do all. Remember, this is not due until Wednesday because tomorrow you have an assessment. You have a big chunk of study time today because we didn't have to go over any assignment today. I would suggest you get at least 2 daily word problems done and turned in, and then spend your time on the assignment. Should be able to get a large part of the assignment done. And if you have questions, we should be able to have time to ask questions. Anybody have anything for me at this time? So 193, 1 through 10. And 194 all. I'd like for you to get 2 daily word questions done and turned in. Get some time up front to work on those, some of you. Please make sure your name is on the daily word paper on the front. First and last name. Any questions? All righty. Any questions from home?